So there we are, Crush Climate Change, U.S. wineries taking climate action. This webinar is going to last an hour. CCL, one of our core values is to treat everyone with appreciation and respect. And out of respect for your time, we will end this formal event promptly at 2 p.m. California time, but we'll leave the Zoom line open with some of us to talk to anyone who wants to stick around. So a little bit, as people are coming in here, I'll tell you about myself. I'm a co-founder, volunteer, and director of Business Climate Leaders. BCL is a project of Citizens Climate Lobby, and CCL is a 12-year-old nonpartisan climate advocacy group. We have over 1/5 supporters in 66 countries and 600 active chapters. And if you haven't heard about us until now, it's probably because we're relatively quiet as climate groups go. We focus on building productive and respectful relationships with our elected and community leaders, including the likes of all you. So next slide, please. Oops, that's the slide I was on last. I think I'm one slide ahead of you, Randy, but go ahead. There's our homepage. The program for today, I'm going to do this welcome and introduction. Jonathan Marshall will talk about carbon fee and dividend, our showcase product. Then we'll have a cross-country conversation between Paul and Jay about the impact on the wine industry and possible solutions. We'll have some Q&A time, and at the very end, we'll send you off with some ideas about what you might do next on this topic. So next slide. So first of all, thank you for joining us at this remarkable, amazing, incredible, challenging, difficult, pick your adjective, time. One thing I'll say about this time is please vote. And if you haven't already voted, if you have already voted, help others vote. Before I introduce the guests and while we wait for the final late arrivals, I'll tell you my story. I've worked in and around the politics and economics of climate, environment, and energy for half a century as both a professional and a volunteer. And I think what I've learned has bearing on our message today. So you'll be hearing a little bit of that from me. Next slide, please. I'm a California guy. I live in Petaluma, just up from San Francisco. Used to be the chicken capital of the world. In the mid-70s, California was planning on having a nuclear power plant, probably by this time, maybe sooner, a nuclear power plant every 5 miles along the entire length of the California coast. And just imagine how much that would cost, much less anything else. We proved, and I include in the we, Governor Jerry Brown, some pretty big fish, the big environmental groups, the utilities, were able through an intensive effort for conservation, efficiency, renewables, to decouple energy growth from economic growth. And climate change wasn't yet an issue, but we proved at that point, at least, that the conventional wisdom about energy and economy was not necessarily wise. From there, next slide. I went on to work for US Senator Bob Packwood. I was an environmental and energy legislative assistant. He was a Republican from Oregon. I was a Democrat Green from Northern California, but we got along just fine. Those were the good old days. And Senator Packwood's legislation for investment tax credits for solar was signed by Jimmy Carter in 1979. And we were all very optimistic. We thought this is going to do it. The 80s will be the dawning of the solar age, according to the trade publication. It took a little bit longer. It was a slow sunrise, took more like 30 years for solar to really take off as it has in the past 10 years. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. After Packwood staff, I went to work for Pacific Gas and Electric, and I was in the engine room of this effort to try to retool the economy and the infrastructure for efficiency and renewables. We gave customers advice and incentives to get them to conserve. This went on for a while, had other jobs in between in technology, but in 2012, we were doing a presentation to our VP there about the progress or lack thereof with our programs. And after that was over, one of my colleagues said, you know, the problem, Bruce, is when given a choice between clean energy and cheap energy, most people will choose cheap. And that's when a light went on for me, because of course we then both said, but it's not cheap, you know, it's ruining the planet. It's going to ruin everything. The fact is that when people paid at the pump, the people paid at the meter. However, they were getting a bargain that they were going to end up having to pay a balloon payment on. So a couple of weeks later, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, yeah. So this is my history and even before I got involved with this, but a lot of stuff has happened to drive, you would think, drive down GHG emissions and shift to renewable energy. You can see, you know, James Hansen, 1988, first talked about climate in Congress. But the net effect of it was that it keeps going up. And right now, I think it's around 415 parts per million. What's going on? All this good intent, all these good ideas, not much progress. We can talk about the politics of that, but I really want to talk about kind of the economics of it. And of course, Jonathan will go into detail on that. But if we look at the, we can, oh yeah, my little story continues. I went to a public hearing on my program at the Public Utilities Commission, and toward the very end of that, this woman got up. Her name's Rachel Guinness. Hi, Rachel, if you're out there. She said the program wasn't working for her. She was a contractor doing this energy efficiency stuff. She was shutting down her business. Then she said, and I'll never forget this, she said, what we need is a steadily increasing fee on carbon emissions that returns all of the revenue to households in monthly dividend per capita payments. And I said to myself, bingo, I can't let her get away. I ran down after the hearing was over and we talked. She invited me to a meeting of this group called Citizens Climate Lobby, never heard of them, to talk about something called carbon fee and dividend, never heard of it. But 8 years later, here I am. So I want to take a bit of a pivot off here if we go to the next slide, and there's going to be a couple of clicks on this one, Randy. What's it like? Oh, I guess they're all going to show up there. 9/9/20, that was my 9/11, the orange apocalypse. So those of you who are in California, especially around where I live in Petaluma, remember what it looked like. My granddaughter here, her name is May. She lives here with her parents. We love it. And she loves to go outside. It's always outside, barefoot. And when she gets out in the garden, she collects stuff. Well, lately it's been, can't go outside, it's too dirty, you know, too smoky. And what bothers me more than the fact that she can't do that is that she is now sort of accepting that as normal. You know, we say outside, we say no, and she goes, too smoky. And I wonder what's going to happen with her 3-year-old and her granddaughter and all of that. But, you know, my problems are trivial. We've had some blackouts, some smoke. Some of you maybe on this call, somebody just wrote the local paper and said they had to plow their 5 acres worth of bumper crop Syrah back into their vineyards because it was smoke tainted. And what about the people who don't have a bank account, and if their crop goes under, they are headed for the city and to be preyed upon by ISIS and the like. So I was pretty depressed that day. That was probably the worst for me ever on climate depression. But next slide, please. The next day I woke up and I went back to work with my volunteer job at Citizens Climate Lobby, Business Climate Leaders. There's my happy granddaughter and I celebrating the clean air. And it's not just doing the work, it's all the people that we're working with. And it's not just in these 2 organizations. There are hundreds of organizations all across the political spectrum and the socioeconomic spectrum. This stuff is moving. So good news. Next slide, please. So I was trying to explain to somebody what business climate leader is and how is it different from 350 or any of the other climate groups. And I think of it like we are union organizers, except we're not organizing the workers, we're organizing the executives. We're not organizing them for wages or working conditions. We're organizing them to take advantage of their policy leverage. And there's some tools that we have for that. One of them is to think about a lot of these companies, a lot of you, I would imagine, are pursuing now this new triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit. That's great. And the more, the better, but that's not going to happen fast enough. that hasn't happened fast enough over the last 40 years. We need to have some big policy changes to push everybody down the path that you've pioneered. There's a couple more P's for you there. So how do we get out of this political inertia that's stuck in the fossil fuel era? Next slide, please. Well, we have a few modest tools that we're focusing on here, especially with the wine industry. This wine industry climate declaration, thanks to some of you who were the first to sign this. We're using this as a vehicle to communicate with our members of Congress about the importance of queuing up this carbon fee and dividend legislation early in the next Congress as the foundation of a climate bill. I think of it as the soil with the fertilizer is going to come on top of that to make a bumper crop of a healthy climate economy. Running away with the metaphors here, but one more thing. We also act as consultants. Our volunteers and CCL and business climate leaders will work with you locally. If you're not used to lobbying at a federal level, a whole bunch of ideas we can share with you. Great if you can join us. Paul, one of our speakers here, met with some of my colleagues, and Mike Thompson, who is not only our member of Congress, but he is also the co-founder and current co-chair of the Congressional Wine Caucus. So that's kind of how we roll. And I think my time is probably up. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Marshall. I'll say just a little bit about him. Jonathan is one of these people you think, oh my God, how do we get this guy and how do we get him for free? He is the former editor of, or former economics editor for the San Francisco Chronicle, and just knows a lot about this and is tireless in his volunteer efforts. So Jonathan, take it away.
Thanks very much, Bruce. In addition to my years at the Chronicle covering economics, I was a founding member of the Economics Policy Network at Citizens Climate Lobby, and I've published widely on energy policy and economics in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Before I begin, I'd just like to also extend my sympathies for the losses that many of you, especially in the wine industry, have sustained from climate-related causes in recent months and years. And I hope that this presentation will offer you some hope that smart policies can mitigate the climate crisis and help save your industry and those of everyone else in this country and abroad. Next slide, please. Most Americans now get it at last. Humanity faces a real climate emergency, but most of us are still very confused about what we can do about it. Individual lifestyle changes are worthy and important, but they won't solve our global crisis. We need to start with a strong national policy that will direct the world's largest economy and second largest source of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide away from fossil fuels. We urgently need to build political support at a national level for ambitious investments in clean energy and innovation, and for ensuring a fair and equitable transition to a low carbon world. Next slide, please. Any solution to the climate crisis must first be effective. It must bring us to net zero emissions no later than about 2050, which means reductions of perhaps 40% or so over the next decade. Those are dramatic but necessary goals. It should also be good for people, helping them afford the transition and improving their health by reducing air pollution. It should be good for the economy by stimulating jobs and economic growth, by putting money in consumers' pockets while guiding new investments in cleaner energy and production. It should be broadly popular, even bipartisan if possible, to ensure the policy doesn't fall victim to changes of administration. And one way to do that is to minimize reliance on the growth of massive government programs and revenues, which provoke pitched battles in Washington. Next slide, please. Well, the secret to such a solution lies in the power of economic incentives to change behavior. We've seen it happen before. According to health experts, the single most powerful program ever devised to reduce lung cancer is the tax on tobacco. You can see as the tax went up, consumption fell dramatically. The same idea applies to greenhouse gas pollution. If you want to discourage something bad, raise its price. Next slide. Led by Janet Yellen, former chair of the Federal Reserve Board, more than 3,500 economists, including 27 Nobel laureates, signed a statement declaring that a steadily rising tax on fossil fuels, that is a carbon tax, is, quote, the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. Well, that's an unprecedented consensus in the profession. Anyone who dismisses carbon taxes at this point is basically an economics denier. Next slide, please. Unlike inflexible regulations, which address only a limited number of sectors, broad market-based taxes on fossil fuels would harness the unique knowledge and motivation of every American consumer and producer to first reduce unnecessary waste of energy. As Bruce showed you with California, energy efficiency can have a dramatic effect on consumption of energy. Raising the price of fossil fuels will encourage consumers and businesses alike to pay more attention to everything from turning out lights to buying more efficient machines and appliances. And that in turn means less energy of all kinds needed to power our economy. Second, it would shift demand towards cleaner products and production methods. As prices shift to reflect the cost of fossil fuels embedded in goods and services, consumers and businesses will choose cleaner alternatives without having to do any special research. Anyone buying a new car will suddenly find electric vehicles looking a lot more affordable than SUVs. Investors will quickly get the message that new solar farms offer much higher returns than new oil pipelines. And third, these taxes will promote innovation to lower costs and accelerate our transition to a cleaner world. Let me just quote Glenn Hubbard, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the George W. Bush administration, who observed, quote, business people don't innovate because it feels good. They innovate because there's a return to that innovation. If you want to return to that innovation, you will need to put a price on carbon, unquote. Next slide, please. Here's how a carbon tax or fee could work, combined with a dividend to rebate revenues to every American. This example is based on pending legislation, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which has more than 80 co-sponsors in Congress. First, starting at the lower left here, a tax would be placed on all fossil fuel extractors or importers based on the expected CO2 pollution created by using these fuels. These several thousand companies already pay excise taxes, so it's simple to administer. The companies would absorb some of the cost and pass the rest on to their customers, creating incentives for all of us to find cleaner alternatives. Then going up, the revenue from this tax will eventually grow to several $100 billion a year. Instead of spending it, the government returns the money to every American in the form of an equal monthly check. This dividend provides financial relief for households and builds support for the policy. By 2030, the annual dividend to a family of four would be anywhere from about $3,500 to $4,500. Next slide, please. A modest but rising carbon tax like this will produce dramatic declines in emissions, as shown by the shaded area projected by economists at Columbia University. The years are at the bottom, a little hard to make out, but you can see dramatic declines of over 80% by 2050, largely wiping out the use of fossil fuels in our economy. Within 10 years alone, we could expect emissions reductions of about 40%. Now, we can and should look at additional policies on top of this. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution and forget about the rest, but this is far and away the single most important and basically also the simplest policy you could imagine. And it will be a driver for any other policies we add. If you add regulations on, they will be supercharged by putting this price on carbon. Next slide, please. Well, these projections aren't just theoretical. Places like British Columbia, United Kingdom, and Sweden have achieved remarkable emissions reductions with carbon taxes. If you look at this chart, US emissions are on the top line, Sweden's on the lower line. They have dramatically reduced emissions since 1990 when they began imposing a carbon tax in some sectors of their economy. Since that time, their GDP has grown 80%, roughly in line with the US, while slashing CO2 emissions by 25%. Today, Sweden emits only a quarter as much CO2 per dollar of GDP as the United States. That's just dramatic. Next slide, please. Well, the carbon fee is what changes behavior to slow the climate crisis, but the dividend is critically important too. First, as I mentioned before, it will help households make an affordable transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy. It also helps make the carbon fee progressive and equitable. 2/3 of households would break even or come out ahead. Poor households actually have the most to gain, as this chart from the US Treasury Department shows. Those are on the left, the lowest income portions of the population. Only the highest 3 deciles would end up having to pay more because they are heavy intensive users of fossil fuels. In addition, returning the revenue in the form of a dividend will make the carbon fee easier to pass in Congress by minimizing partisan battles. It will also build long-term support from the public and their elected leaders. And finally, putting cash in the hands of the public will actually provide a modest consumption stimulus and thus generate jobs and economic productivity. Next slide, please. Well, all of these attributes actually satisfy what I mentioned at the beginning of just all the things we would want a policy to do, being effective, affordable, good for people, good for the economy, and so on. But we need to make it happen. Just because it makes good sense doesn't make it an automatic no-brainer. To get it passed, we need political will. And that's where Citizens Climate Lobby and you come in. There are close to 500 grassroots chapters of CCL in the United States now. Around the country, they're promoting this bipartisan approach of carbon fee and dividend through a host of methods, ranging from letters to the editor to in-person meetings with representatives in Congress. And this photo shows our citizen lobbyists on Capitol Hill, I think about a year ago. Critically important to our mission, though, is enlisting support from community stakeholders, including business owners like many of you. Our legislators listen closely to your opinions. By adding your name to BCL's Wine Industry Declaration, or otherwise getting involved in this cause, you can help make carbon fee and dividend a central part of any national legislation passed next year to tackle the climate crisis. I hope you'll get involved and enjoy the rest of our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan, packaging that in a few slides in a few minutes. There's a lot more there, but I think it gives you a pretty good picture of what this is and how it might be different than other sort of climate solutions that you've encountered. Next up, we've got 2 of our winemaker guests. Jay Raffaldini he's one of the pioneers of this, maybe the charter member of the Wine Declaration from the East Coast, North Carolina, and Paul Shakeshaft, who I've been working with extensively here in California, particularly the Northern California, on outreach to wineries. And Paul lives in Marin, but works in the Napa Valley. So I shall leave it to the 2 of you to have your conversation cross country.
Tell you what, can I jump in? Because I'd like to sort of just go off of what Jonathan just said and give me a couple minutes, and then because Jay's got a little bit different story for the East Coast, and he's also a much smaller winery than me. I think that he'll have some views that are, I think, match up with, sort of a more local kind of thing sometimes. Again, the name is Paul Shakeshaft. I'm located in Marin County, California, pretty close to Napa, people here know that. My everyday business is winery management. Our winery is Appalachian Trading Company in Napa. We produce about 100,000 cases a year, which is a lot bigger than most wineries and a lot smaller than the really big guys. But, you know, across all winery sizes, the wine business is an ag business. And as an ag business, it's sort of that canary in a coal mine idea. You know, if we look forward, you know, vines, the constant attention year round, and then it culminates in, you know, harvest, crush. But, you know, one of the things we see, of course, every year in, year out, more and more we're seeing heat. And what does heat mean? It means big heat spikes, shortened growing seasons, drier winters. You know, these are danger signs all over the place. So I'm always, you know, we look around and we say, you know, what if we want to turn this around, you know, Jonathan, you know, what do we do? And so you've just heard Jonathan speak about this, but it's, you know, without a national or global pressure to decrease carbon usage, which HR 763 provides, the CCL measure, all the managers in all these wineries are acting without a fixed cost manual. They're all going around doing things by themselves. You know, there are wineries out there that are doing great jobs. They're buying green. They're using carbon sequestration in the vineyards. I don't know if anybody has listened to Paul Dolan speak. It's like this beautiful vision of the future. He's fantastic. But the rest of us need standard, replicable practices. So here's an example. Wine storage. At my winery, we keep any place from 13,000 to 25,000 gallons pretty much constantly. That has to be kept at 58 degrees, bottles a little bit warmer. So it's about $5,500 to $6,500 a month that I pay PG&E for that. You know, like most wineries, we have a hodgepodge of cooling, but we know it can be improved. I can install more solar batteries. I can install better AC systems, cool doors, night cooling systems. We know solutions are coming. But let's say that as the carbon tax comes in, my costs go up. I react. And any increase in my carbon-based electrical billing can be easily mitigated. The savings exceed any costs right now. The carbon decline, if everybody in my world, all across Napa, all down the coast, made those tiny decisions, it would make a gigantic change in what was coming in the meter. My point is that from really experience in this, because I've had all these guys come in my door, but I'm not doing anything because I'm really not being forced to. The rising carbon costs will trigger both savings and a decline in usage. But, you know, it's not just about money. It is about money, but it's mostly about other things. The question comes up is sort of, why should we care? You know, the wine business, sometimes, you know, we're small and most of the places are, you know, you're sort of making this thing and it's a little arty. But wine is magic. That's why wine is a common centerpiece in so many religions. God lets simple fruit turn into this wonderful drink. Magic. It's a magic experience when we taste, when we share it, we give it to people, our friends, we toast with it. It's one of the best things we do in this world. So, you know, and one of the most beautiful things about wine and winemaking is the endless effort that thousands of people make to create this art we call wine. So when I look out there this year, and it's happened other years, but this year is just so bad, and it's such an example of what's going on. And we see a whole vintage from Paso Robles in the south to Mendocino way up north, just wiped out. It's like our cultural markers are getting wiped out. A good example of this again is there's a vineyard over in France called Domaine Romani-Conti. Everybody knows about them. It's a tiny little vineyard in Burgundy. It has this reputation worldwide as making like the world's best wine. It's been there for 500 years. Every year they know what year the first buds come out. They know what day they are going to harvest. They count the grapes every year. It's an amazing thing. Well, guess what? They're now harvesting DRC weeks and weeks early. So we've toasted it. Think about that. Well, anyhow, I mean, there's still a lot of good 2018 red out there, so stock up. Anyhow, that's my bit for today.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Jay Raffaldini. I'm the owner and founder of Raffaldini Vineyards in North Carolina. And obviously, 90% of the vineyards are in 3 Western states. So the other 47 states do have vineyards, as we know. It's so fascinating because the challenges we're having climatically is the exact opposite of you out west. What I mean by that is we are having unprecedented year after year record rainfall. To kind of give you some sense of it, normal rainfall in North Carolina, Virginia, or up and down the East Coast is about 30 to 35 inches a year, which sounds a lot, but that's normal for us. Over this year and the 2 prior years, we've averaged 60 to 70 inches of rain. 60 to 70 inches, to just sort of fathom that number, where you all get nothing out west. So when you have rain, you have clouds. And when you have clouds, you don't have sun or heat. So it's a huge problem growing our grapes and ripening our grapes. So I think what climate change is doing is it's creating extremes from both sides. And while the fires are terrible, we have equal problems on this side. So I think it's a global problem of significant size. I'm one of those nasty Wall Street guys who happens to own a hedge fund. We're always vilified because we're Wall Street guys, right? Who have these, boutique boutique vineyards and stuff like that. So the reason I mention this to you is we've been investing our money and our clients' money for decades. And what started about 3 or 4 years ago took us by surprise. And it was our clients' requests to invest in green technologies. It was our clients' requests to do things that are value additive to the environment. And that's something that we didn't really see coming. And it was led by the European clients that we have. So much so now that it is an enormous part of our business. So for example, when we're talking about the Paris Accords, what we're effectively talking about is reducing global emission. And when you reduce global emission, you're effectively talking about electrification, because electrification is the way to do that. So when we're doing that, you're talking about a massive investment in infrastructure that's required. And how do you get there? Now, being a Wall Street guy, the easiest way is that something that we earn a rate of return on. And Jonathan talked about it before. And so our view here is the investment in reducing global emissions is the single most profitable thing an investor can do the next 20 to 30 years. It's kind of like investing in the automotive industry and highways just as the car was getting invented. That's the size of the investment that's needed, but that's also the size of the opportunity. So Wall Street guys are greedy in a sense that it's all about making money. And this is the greatest way to make money because the opportunity is enormous and it's broad. And you could just see it in the behavior of utilities now that are more green. They're trading at a higher price than ones that are not green, or companies like Tesla or other green focused companies where their value is more than GM and Ford combined. So people are saying, we want this. So the question is, how do we get there? Right? And one way is through carbon taxation. And another way, easily, is through subsidizing, meaning giving investment incentives. So you have full write-offs of the solar, you have full write-offs for the charging stations, you have full write-offs for sequestration. That's happening. slowly but methodically. So whether you see it or not, money is moving in that direction on an enormous scale, and the scale of it required is enormous. So it's a very exciting time to be an investor in this space, and also exciting time to be a vineyard. Now, how we are responding at the vineyard level is we're doing everything that we can. And what's keeping us from doing more is the availability of choices. We're not, in the East Coast, how many electric tractors do you have? How many biodiesel things do you have? There's not a lot of options for sequestration. So we're limited by our ability to actually engage in these areas, which is why if you're a businessman, you want to start a company and you'll be successful. So for me, how I approach, climate change and the reduction of global emissions is both as a vineyard owner, as an investor, it's an enormous opportunity to do good and to make high returns for my investors. So I am fully supportive, whether that's done through taxation, whether that's done through innovation, or the third leg, investment tax credits. We're all moving in that direction. The world has moved. We have not. And one last bit of economics, I'm sorry about that, is when Europe needed to stimulate their economy and US needed to stimulate their economy, they went in two different paths. US gave tax cuts, right? And Europe invested in green infrastructure, carbon emission technologies. They had the same amount of money, $500 billion was spent in two different directions. And that money in the US is going in very, very different directions. And in Europe, they're moving forward. So we need to get on the train. It's happening with investors, and investors tend to drive the change. So it's a very exciting time to be part of this industry and this overall movement that we have. And it's a groundswell and it's growing very quickly. So,
Thanks, Jay. I was going to, we're supposed to start the Q&A part in a minute, but I thought I would just jump in because I wanted to hear more about the dividend. We're talking about money and we're talking about costs, but I think an underrated part of this proposal, the secret sauce, as I have called it, is the fact that the dividend is substantial. And I created, based on this Regional Economic Models Inc. did a study for Citizens Climate Lobby, super high reputation, nonpartisan group. And using that, their methodology, we created this calculator, and my little family, 5 here with 4 adults and little Mechan, in the first year, our monthly dividend would be around $83 a month. In the 5th year, it would be $367. And that's because the fee is going to go up and up and up as it starts to bite into the fossil fuel usage. My question is, am I right in thinking that some of that money might get spent on wine, as well as better healthcare, as well as who knows what? And how does the wine industry perceive stimulus and the stimulus potential of this bill?
If I was going to jump in on that, I'll tell you what I'd say. As soon as when the economy shut down in March, everybody was like, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is terrible. What's going to happen to the economy?" But in the wine business, it was clear what was happening. People were staying home and drinking. So yes, if people have money in their pocket, they do go out and buy bottles of wine. That's a fact. People enjoy themselves, we'll call it, instead of drinking. People have a bottle of wine in the best of times, and they have a bottle of wine in the worst of times. And hopefully we'll put the getting their carbon, their $80 a month, in the best of times.
This is Jonathan. Just wanted to weigh in. We got a question about whether the dividend just offsets the increased cost of energy from the tax. In a sense it does, but the incentive effect of the tax is still very strong, shifting people to low carbon forms of energy and production so that they can save money. Those who hold on to the old ways will be net payers, and those who consume less or consume cleaner will be net beneficiaries of this. And it will have a very powerful motor effect on the whole economy. I also just wanted to comment, Jay's perspective was very good from the standpoint of a business person, but I wanted just to mention one little distinction. there are some advantages to a carbon fee versus the subsidies. Subsidies to energy, first of all, have a cost to the general fund, which means there's money that you could be spending on other programs that now are going to producers. Many of those producers of solar and wind and other clean energy would have been producing anyway, because those are now becoming quickly the lowest cost forms of energy. If you start giving them subsidies, you're throwing a lot of money away unnecessarily. Their businesses can thrive wonderfully if fossil fuels, which are now subsidized, lose their subsidy and pay the full cost of their pollution. So they won't need subsidies in the future. And last but not least, subsidizing clean energy sounds great until you realize that it's actually a tax on energy efficiency. You don't want energy to be arbitrarily cheap. That discourages people from looking for ways to use less energy. We don't want people to have to become energy misers here, but energy efficiency is a perfectly good and, in fact, probably the single best vehicle for cleaning up our economy. So you don't want to discourage that by subsidizing energy too much.
Yeah, so I think, so if I could respond to that, I think the point of what I was saying is really about subsidizing behavior at the end user level, right? And when you can make the marginal dollar to switch interesting, that's when people switch. But in order for us to make that switch, we need to have the infrastructure in place. We need to have the choices in place. We need to have the equipment in place. That's not there yet, right?
Mhm.
All decided we're going in this direction all at once. We can't. So it really needs to be a top-down, policy-driven directive that has that around it. Otherwise, I think we're going to just fall off our own weight, which is why groups like this are so important, is that it gets it organized in a very efficient manner.
I would also add that one of the key underrated benefits of the measure that we talked about, this Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, is that the tax starts at a rather low level. Some, climate activists want a really high tax or super strong regulations to start. And we think it will have more political durability if we ease our way in to this transition, but then ramp it up very steadily and strongly, giving the economy and the people in it a chance to make this transition so that they won't rebel against it. That's really critical. So that there is lots of innovation going on with this carbon tax starting at a low number, $15 per ton. It won't create a price shock, but will start people moving in the right direction, and that'll pick up steam over time.
I would point out that, it was just a few years ago that I would say 2012 or something like that, there was a big effort to reduce packaging, extra packaging in a lot of different areas. And one of them in the wine business was to create lighter wine bottles. People always talk about that. It's 20% of the carbon footprint for wine. Owens, Illinois did come out with what they called eco glass. And I mean, these things they'll come along pretty fast. If there's a general move, if there's incentive through a carbon tax, these things will become much more palatable and more interesting to people, and they'll get used out there. The more they get used, the more that retail likes them, and the more retail likes them, the more that wineries will use them. But that bottle, just when they say eco glass, a typical bottle weighs something between 600 and 700 grams and can go up to 3,600 grams very easily for those really nice big bottles that I like. But these were down in like the 510 gram, but so they were really light bottles, which uses a ton less energy to make. So anyhow,
I think we have done projections on the cost of such a tax to the wine industry, and it's rather low. It's not going to bankrupt any winemakers, maybe starting at about 2 cents a bottle in the first year, rising to about 11 cents or so after 10 years. A lot of that increase in cost is due to the energy embedded in bottling and shipment costs. So that would not, again, not be enough to bankrupt anyone, but it would certainly be enough to make a smart winemaker investigate those lighter bottles. And once they do, it will reward those who decide to be early adopters of cleaner technology. Right now, we appeal to their generosity of spirit and so forth. We can in the future appeal to their good business sense to adopt cleaner alternatives. Once they do, the market for those lighter bottles will grow. There'll be cost efficiency in production, and it will seem like a no-brainer for everyone in the industry to move towards such bottles.
Exactly.
Right. I'd like to ask a question, if I may. First for Jonathan and then for Jay, there's a question in terms of what keeps the money from the carbon fee from just being used and spent in it, however the government wants, basically leading to bigger government, which is definitely a concern among conservatives. And with that question, as a follow-up to Jay, who operates in North Carolina, a very conservative area. I know you are in a conservative district. Any thoughts you have in terms of engaging with members and as a winemaker on climate policy?
Well, Randy, I would say there will be political battles over all aspects of climate policy to be expected. And as members of Congress and their constituency next year look at these carbon fee and dividend bills, there are plenty of people who do want to spend the revenues on investing more in green energy or giving money to different constituencies. And many of those are worthy ends, but there are plenty of fiscal conservatives and suspicious conservatives who don't want to grow the size of government. In the end, I think that they will have to come up with a compromise. And I don't know precisely where that lies. The beauty of the CCL program is it's clean and simple. It says we have a huge general fund to spend on all sorts of things. Let's keep this policy out of the partisan fray of how to spend all that money. And in the process, we achieve a great deal of fairness and equity, which should appeal to progressives by moderately benefiting lower income Americans. So it's a win-win. And there are conservatives out there who even like that. So, but where the legislative sausage making ends up, none of us can predict. But it's a good, clean place to start the policy debate.
So I think in terms of how we started, when it talks to our congressman or how when we talk to investors about the opportunity, it's about jobs. Always about jobs. This is how you start the conversation, right? Because this is a job creation act. Right? The fact that it reduces carbon emissions is really secondary to a lot of congressmen's minds. I'll give you an example. You look at the solar industry versus the coal industry. Okay, coal industry is subsidized. Solar is not. There's twice as many jobs in the solar industry than there is in coal. Coal is getting subsidized. So we have to change how it's presented to the most conservative people, because all conservatives, all Republicans, and I'm in one of the most conservative places in the planet here. They're really about jobs. And good, high-paying jobs. And this, the same thing, it's when the automotive industry was invented, all the people with the horses and carriage and buggy whips were screaming for subsidies because that's the nature of technological disruption. And if we can do this correctly, then it just multiplied feed on itself. And then it becomes a leading job-creating industry that has all these externalities that are positive. So the story is there, and I hate to focus on it so much because it's economics and finance, but that's what moves it at the needle. And I think we've already started the transition over that point. We just haven't seen it yet because it's not done via policy. It's being done all through investments globally right now.
Great, thanks. A couple questions about regenerative agriculture. Paul, I know you're not actually growing. You're buying grapes, but what do you see in terms of regenerative ag in Sonoma, Napa, or where you're buying. And Jay, I'm wondering if that is part of the things that you're looking at your vineyard.
Well, I guess is the question regeneratively mean vineyard practices to mitigate carbon?
Yeah, to sequester carbon.
Yeah. Again, I mentioned Paul Dolan, and there's a bunch of other sources to use. I mean, there's a lot of fabulous examples and data out there for exactly how to farm better and get better results out of your vineyard without and have massive carbon sequestration in the vineyards. But if we dry, so we're in harvest right now, and then after harvest, they're going to let the vine, let all the mustard grow up between the vines, and it's going to be very, very pretty. And then in about let's say someplace the beginning of June, you're going to see all of a sudden they'll cut down all the mustard, and then they'll mow it down, and then they'll disc between the vines. And you'll see it, and it's going to look so pretty. And that's why everybody does it, because it makes the vineyards look so neat and clean. But it's there, but you're just like absolutely opening up all that carbon right to the atmosphere right there. And you're going to have to get a lot of people who say, oh, we don't need to make the vineyards look that great, because it's not a picture. It's actually just a vineyard. And so I'm going to tell you, there's an awful lot of just mind thinking of what do I want my vineyards to look like, and then old-fashioned ideas getting moved forward by people who have new training out of Davis and Cal Poly and Fresno, who can say, no, this works. It's going to be better for your vineyard, but it's not happening a lot now.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that. We Citizens Climate Lobby are working a lot in the ag sector, and there's a lot of interest and support from the regenerative element of that. Big commodity stuff, not so much yet. But this bill does nothing for encouraging putting carbon back into the soil, however that might be done. It does address the cost of fuel, the so-called red diesel that's used. This was a concession to the large commodity farmers, that it's not subject to the tax. But the important thing to remember, I like to at least quote Paul Shakeshaft, who wrote Drawdown or organized the Drawdown project. And there's so much in there that isn't directly energy related. He told us this, that effective carbon pricing would accelerate every climate solution described in Drawdown. So while this bill doesn't do everything, it supports in a variety of ways the other things that also need to be done, including out and out subsidies and R&D support for the so-called carbon farming. So I want to make sure that you are all aware of that. And then the people like myself who support this bill are also supporting all these other things as well. So it's all part of the same political effort. And we are at 1:55, which is when we said we would do a wrap up. So I don't know, Randy, see any other really big questions that we want to tackle right now, or? I'm going to cover one of them in the wrap up.
Why don't you go ahead, Bruce, and then we'll have time afterwards if anybody wants to stick around and ask more questions.
Okay, yeah, if you went after the Q&A, there's a resources for the wine industry slide. And I just wanted to point this out. We are recording this. This video will be available for you and your colleagues who couldn't make it. And this content is available online now. But the resources for the wine industry, we have the wine declaration at the top of that list. We have, there's an organization we're working with. I have some friends at Jackson Family Winery who organized this, International Wineries for Climate Action. And they're all about a real science-based rigor approach to reducing emissions across the industry, supply chain, in the vineyards, in the wineries, and so on. So I recommend them. Another organization that one of our signers is involved with, the Porto Protocol International, working more on the policy side. Here is the link to the Congressional Wine Caucus homepage, which happens to be on Mike Thompson's congressional website. And Dan Newhouse, who's a Republican from Washington, and I think I see one of the CCL liaison to him in the audience here. They, and I think Craig Preston mentioned, you know, how do we work with this group? They have their ears open to the winemakers and the wine industry in their districts. And we are always happy, we Citizens Climate Lobby are happy to get together with any business owners and arrange for conversations with these representatives. So a lot of potential there. We did a webinar, or we participated in a webinar that Lafort put on a couple of months ago, Making Wine in a Changing Climate. The entire 3 hours of that was recorded. And if you're interested in just some more of the adaptation approaches, that might be a place to look. Last but not least, there's our friend Randy here, who is the Business Climate Leaders Food and Beverage Lead, working with a number of other groups as well. There's his email. If I could go to the next slide. And these are resources for business in general. So Business Climate Leaders, again, we're an action team from Citizens Climate Lobby. We're trying to define the leading edge of getting businesses involved in that fourth P of the quadruple bottom line policy. There's our info address. We have this one-page guide, which it's like, well, I'm not in a position to be able to go public on this now, but I'd be interested in having a lunch and learn for my 133 employees at SunPower in Richmond, California, which we recently did. So there's options that you can explore to pursue this without necessarily putting yourself somewhere where you're not comfortable. Series, very well established, good partner of ours, and also climate collaborative in the natural products industry, very active in working on the policy side of things with climate. So Randy, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's great, Bruce. I just popped the link to the Wine Industry Climate Declaration. If there's anybody that wants to take a look at that and give that a read, it's in the chat. Again, happy to please email me and let us know what we can do to help. So with that, I think we'll end the webinar, and I'll stop recording for now. But I'm here, and if Jay and Paul and Bruce are willing, and Jonathan are willing to stick around for a minute or two, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to ask them, and happy, and really appreciate you being here. Appreciate all that you guys are doing. And cheers. Here's to hopefully bountiful, delicious wine now and in the future. So thank you.
Okay, good, right on time.